hot.
All right, the council asked to have a presentation on short-term rentals. I was gonna try to include ADUs as part of that discussion because there has been some changes, recently and some information that I think you would want to know, but, one, I didn't think we were gonna have time to talk about ADUs, cause I think once you dive into it, there's a lot there. So I'll just talk about short-term rentals. Before I get started, how many in this room have stayed in a short-term rental? Everyone? Jared raised his hand, I can see
I
him
have not.
raise his hand.
Weekend.
Never in here.
Okay, everyone but one person.
I have not.
How many of you have stayed in a short-term rental here in Utah? Raise your hand. So, easily the majority. Short-term rentals are one of those love-hate relationships. We all like them, if not prefer them over a hotel, especially if you're gonna have a family gathering and you don't wanna stay in 5 different rooms in a hotel with that X amount of money that doesn't even have cooking facilities. But at the same time, they do cause some inconveniences, especially when you look at neighborhood feel. I wanna get to know the neighbor next to me. And when that neighbor is now a short-term renter, I only get to see them for 2 days at a time, and they're gonna have ATVs and UTVs running up and down the street. That can cause some problems.
Is he done?
I'll click through for you.
That was a good presentation, Todd. Nice picture. All done. See?
That can cause some problems, man.
Silence time to go home.
Alright, so I don't know if you know the history about short-term rentals, but pre-2017, we knew what short-term rentals were. They were just known by a different name, vacation rentals. And then in 2007, there was an idea created by 2 roommates, and I believe it was San Francisco.
Stanford, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, and they thought, well, we have a blow-up mattress, we can throw it on the ground and provide a bed and breakfast, but we need an online platform to make it happen. And that's how Airbnb was born. And once Airbnb was live, that's when short-term rentals became a thing and became huge. Before 2008, it really wasn't a problem in communities, except for highly destination communities. After 2008, it's a $1 billion industry in the U.S. Worldwide, it's crazy. Over 1 million listings in the U.S.
Oh, it's a good brainchild.
So this is what, when you think of a short-term rental, this is kind of what you think of. You know, house in Park City, a guest house in Heber. Some things that I thought you would find kind of interesting is these are real mud huts in Moab, a teepee in Hannah, an Airstream trailer in Levin, Bilbo Baggins' house from Lord of the Rings, in Cedar City as a guest house. And then, yes, Herriman has a barn that you can rent out. I don't think it's technically in Herriman, but I think it's up the canyon, so.
That's awesome.
The pictures inside were pretty cool. The benefits of short-term rentals, we talked about some of them. Just a different option than what we're normally used to. And hotels are only located in so many places. What if there is not a hotel? You don't want to drive a half an hour when we had some friends that came from out of town, and in my neighborhood, there are some hotels kind of nearby, but they wanted to be down the street. So they just got an Airbnb for a couple of weeks, stayed down the street, and that was like so much better than being at a hotel. Price. I just went on Airbnb and Expedia for Park City, and I was trying to find the cheapest 1-bedroom as a hotel, which Silver Lodge is $404, and on Airbnb there's $261. So they can be way more expensive, short-term rentals can, but they can be significantly cheaper too. Other benefits of short-term rental, you get to meet different people out of the country. That was one thing I loved about being in St. George, being by Zion's, is all the diversity that comes. It's really cool to go to Zion's and you see all these people from different countries speaking different languages. I thought it was really cool. Money, and this is multifaceted, so tourism. people come in, and if they're staying in your community, they likely spend money in your community. This also helps the property owner out, for sure. There's no question about it. If the property owners didn't get money, they wouldn't do it. It can help the municipality out on transient room tax. You can have these cool development opportunities too. For example, in Washington City, right next to St. George, D.R. Horton has a 600 acre development, and they have a section. So it's all houses. There's no commercial. And in the middle of it, they have one of the pods dedicated for short-term rentals. So that way, everyone around it, if they have friends and family staying in, they can rent out one of those short-term rentals. Not only that, but those short-term rentals are not owned by D.R. Horton. They're owned by individuals like any one of us could. So it gives some opportunities for development that you probably wouldn't see otherwise. What are the issues with it? These are just a couple that I pulled up. Salt Lake Tribune has several articles. St. George News has several articles. All these are different communities. And we're seeing more and more debate about short-term rentals and whether or not they're good. Some issues, like I mentioned at the beginning, lost that residential feel, nuisance for the neighbors, light, noise, trash, fire safety, parking issues. You get a 3,000 square foot house and people are trying to cram 20 people in there to make it more affordable, and you have cars lined up and down the street. The biggest discussion right now is housing. There have been about 12 studies, empirical studies that have been done. This was kind of one that I think summed it up the best. Our main results imply that for the average neighborhood, Airbnb activity has increased rents by 1.9%, transaction prices by 4.6%, and posted prices by 3.7%. However, there was a study that was done about a year and a half ago by AirDNA, and they looked at all the studies and they wanted to know, is this accurate, one, and two, where is this affecting housing prices? Because it seems like Park City might have a different housing crisis than Price, Utah. And that's what they found. The effect of short-term rentals on housing prices is smaller than the initial study would suggest, localized in highly tourist areas. So if you're a tourist area, short-term rentals can be a problem. They're going to increase your prices. They're going to take away from housing stock. And maybe they don't have more land availability to build more units. So the Kim Gardner Institute did a study 2 years ago now, and it was actually the Utah Leagues of Cities and Towns asked them to figure out what short-term rentals look like here in Utah. So here's a map of all the counties, and they just looked at it from a county level. So you can see Summit County has 6,000 short-term rentals in their community. Salt Lake has 3,400, Washington County 28. So you can see that the destination areas have more short-term rentals.
Tom,
However,
those are licensed though, correct?
What was that?
They're licensed or
I
identified, or is that?
I think they looked at Airbnb,
Listings?
like the listings, and not necessarily whether they're permitted or
Okay.
not. What they also did is not just look at the numbers of how many listings there were, but housing stock. How does that compare? Summit County, Park City, 23% of their housing stock is being used as short-term rentals. I think Park City itself is more like 30%.
Makes sense.
You can see that that's a big problem when over a quarter of your houses are being used for short-term rentals in an already unaffordable area. Grand County, so Moab, and again, this is all Grand County, so Moab's probably higher than that, but they have a very limited area of land and a lot of people touring, so you can see some of the problems. But I do want to point out Salt Lake County. So even though we have a technically high number of short-term rentals, only 0.8% of that is being taken away from the housing stock. So it's really not a problem in Salt Lake County. But you can kind of see where those issues lie. I want to take you through the history of how we got to where we're at today as far as Utah code and legislation that keeps being proposed. So in 2017, this is Representative Notwell's bill. So he passed a bill defining short-term rentals, and what apparently was an issue is that cities would see listings on Airbnb, send them a notice of violation because they didn't allow for short-term rentals, and prosecute them based on them listing it. So he wanted to fix this issue by prohibiting cities and counties that they couldn't prohibit an individual from offering a short-term rental on a short-term rental website, and they couldn't punish an individual solely for the act of listing or offering a short-term rental on a short-term rental website. This is different than a lot of states. Some states say that if you list something on a short-term rental website, then that is evidence that you are in the act of doing it. Kind of like, maybe this is more on the criminal side, but if you solicit a teenager, that solicitation is a crime. Notwell believed that this was a First Amendment right. So I have the right of listing it. It doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong. So a little, kind of unique to Utah. So this is referred to the Notwell language. And then there's we can review rental agreements, which is kind of a weird ordinance that was passed. So 2021, we got two bills. Senator Andrig, I put him in purple because he comes up on several bills. So he wanted to prohibit municipalities from enacting or enforcing an ordinance that would not allow owner-occupied short-term rentals. I'll get to that in a minute. And then it prohibits municipalities from using tax revenue on short-term rentals for the purpose of enforcing. So in other words, you can't use your money to use that as enforcement against short-term rentals. So this was more restrictive to municipalities. And then HB 82. So this one is the ADU bill that came out a couple of years ago. And this bill proposed that the Notwell language would not apply to IAD. So in other words, if you have an internal accessory dwelling unit, you can still prosecute them for listing on a short-term rental on a short-term rental website. I don't know why that is, but that's how it was passed. Then we got a couple bills in 2022. Representative Benyon, she comes up a couple times, so that I highlighted her in green. But each one of these bills for the last couple of sessions were, I want to restrict municipalities and what they can do, or I want to give as much power to municipalities as I can, so you can prosecute these cases. So you get these kind of opposite sides from each of these legislators. Benyon and Andrick are definitely on opposite sides. Again, more legislation this past year, and you probably heard about this. Musselman's bill went pretty far. This was, we wanted to create a pilot program, a voluntary pilot program for cities. And if the city entered into this voluntary program, then that would legalize all the illegal short-term rentals, but cities, you get a higher transient room tax. And then there are some other conditions that cities had to have so many short-term rentals and offered in the city. And then Benyon again wanted to give more power to municipalities, saying you can restrict the number of people that can be in there. You can have a local contact if the person doesn't live within 60 miles. So again, kind of opposite ends of bills being passed. And I think it's that love-hate relationship that each of us have.
Like noisy cars, you mean?
What was that?
The love-hate relationship with noisy cars? Like
Yeah.
that too.
So what can cities do about it? And this has been the question that's been asked from planners and city attorneys and even developers. So in our code, we do not allow for short-term rentals. They're not permitted. It says that twice in the code. But you go on Airbnb and there are about 44 listings. You can tell this, I think, is outside city limits. We are getting transient room tax. So we definitely know that there are that being offered. Is it a problem? I don't think we're a destination community where there's a ski resort that people are trying to stay at and do it at a cheaper price or something like that. So it doesn't seem like it's a problem here, but we have a prohibition, and it for at least 44 people, they don't care.
And or don't know.
They don't know.
Or don't. They might not know. And that'd be a good question, actually. Because I've been in this position long enough, I'm like, why wouldn't you check your local
Yeah.
regulations?
I think
Of course you would do
a
that.
lot of people probably just simply don't know. If they're in an HOA, they probably know. If they're not in an HOA, they're like, why can't I rent out a room?
Yeah. So there are some options for cities that do want to regulate them, beyond, just being silent or, doing a straight prohibition like Herriman. So you have zoning authority, and we have authority under the Utah laws to zone, and to enact zoning ordinances. You can, for permitting, you can permit businesses and you can regulate them and you can charge fees. So there's a couple tools that we have to regulate short-term rentals. So I think policy considerations, if you do want to have short-term rental regulations, are what type of community do you have? Do you want more people visiting your community? Do you have appropriate resources, specifically code enforcement, I think is going to be the issue. What's your ideology as it relates to property rights, and what does your general plan say? And I thought this was a good quote by Cheshire Cat. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So if you can tackle those policy ideals, then you're going to create a code that's much more focused on what your community needs. These were just policy considerations that I thought of, and you might want to say, I don't want short-term rentals because I'm Park City and we don't have any housing that does it. So you can identify your policy. You can state why you came up with that policy and why you came up with those regulations. You might want to limit the number of short-term rentals or semi-limit them, and there's some policy considerations, or you just might want to allow them. We want short-term rentals. Cedar City has an interesting code. They identify short-term rentals are compatible for residential zones. They just own it in their code. They have some regulations, but those regulations are fairly minor. So I think for Cedar City, who's competing with St. George and Washington for getting that tourist money there, yeah, why don't allow for it? Or why don't allow for visiting and investors to come in? So if you do have short-term rentals, you definitely want definitions. What are short-term rentals? What are they not? What is a dwelling? What can people stay in, and what can they not? So a tent, you can see this on Airbnb. People will rent out their tent in someone's front yard or backyard and say that's a short-term rental. There's no toilets, there's no showers, there's no. So you want to figure out what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. Location. Do you want them in all zones? Some cities allow them in every single zone. Some cities allow them and only regulate them in residential zones. Do you want there to be a difference between a commercial zone, maybe you don't care if there's a short-term rental there, versus a residential zone where you might care because neighbors are gonna possibly have more complaints? Do you want to allow them in internal or external ADUs? Limit the number of short-term rentals in a neighborhood. Limit the number of short-term rentals based on population. I've seen both of these. So Sandy, I gotta confess, I just got a short-term rental license from Sandy City. It was quite the process, but I did because my friend that lives in the basement, they're buying a house in Eagle Mountain, and we're like, well, we don't really want to have people down there that we don't know, but at the same time, we don't need that space. So why not have a little bit of extra income, and then when family comes in, we can rent it out. So Sandy, they limit the number of short-term rental permits based on the number of houses in that subdivision. So my subdivision, the Willow Creek subdivision, there's so many houses and there's 11 permits available, and it's first come, first serve. And then you get put on a waiting list if there aren't any permits left. Hurricane, on the other hand, they limit the number of short-term rentals based on population. So they say for every 1,000 people, we will give 3 short-term rental permits. So in my calculation, that's about 66 permits. They have some other allowances for if it's owner occupied, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's extremely limited. But their analysis, I'm assuming, is as the community grows, we're okay with some additional permits coming in. I'm not feeling well, and I can always tell that I'm not that I'm not feeling well when my voice becomes like Steve's. It's like 10 octaves lower than it normally is. Do you want exceptions for your development partners? Washington City is a good example of this, because they say we're allowed short-term rentals if it's 5 acres or more, because essentially we want development communities to allow for short-term rentals, like the D.R. Horton community that I mentioned before, but I don't want it in the old portion of the city. Some other zoning regulations that you can consider: parking, noise, property maintenance. I don't know if that's really a problem, just because I think if you want to rent out your property, you want to make it look nice, but I've seen those regulations. There's a lot of cities, and I mean a lot of cities, that have an owner occupancy requirement. But there was a case that came out last year. New Orleans had an owner occupancy restriction saying, if the owner lives there, we will give you a permit. However, if the owner does not live there, then we will not. I don't know if you've heard about the Commerce Clause. That's the in the Constitution. We can't restrict movement between states. The Dormant Commerce Clause is treating something better within your state different than out-of-state people. And that's where the court said, people from out-of-state can't invest in a short-term rental, and so you're treating your residents more favorably, and that violates the Constitution. So I've been cautioning when I gave this presentation a couple weeks ago at the Utah Land Use Institute. Not even the Utah Property Rights Ombudsman had read that case, and which was concerning because he has been advising cities to do the owner occupancy restriction.
Oh, jeez.
That's awesome.
Now there's another case out of Santa Monica, so in the Ninth Circuit. They had a residency requirement, meaning that someone had to be in the home to kind of address some of the issues like noise and parking. So in theory, if someone's living in that home, then people that are there on a short-term basis aren't going to be as noisy because they know that someone's living down there. They said that did not violate the Constitution because you did not have to be a resident of the city in order to. In other words, I could buy a home in Santa Monica. I could have a long-term rental there, and then also do a short-term rental in the basement. And that's totally fine. You can limit the number of people. I would also caution this. Again, this goes to the Dormant Commerce Clause. I've also seen cities that have differences between, you can have up to eight people if they're all related, or you can have 4 if they're unrelated. I think that's borderline unconstitutional, if not blatantly unconstitutional. You can limit the numbers of rooms or nights. I haven't seen anything in case law that indicates that that's unconstitutional.
Todd, on the number of people, like, so even in the condo in St. George, like, they have the fire marshal says X 18 max occupancy or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that something that could be restricted there for square footage or for whatever it means?
Yeah. So there's not a general regulation that says that if it's this size, then you can have this many people. But what I've generally seen is that there can be at least 2 people per room. And then you might have another allowance of +4. So if you have a 3-bedroom home, you can have 6 people for the home, and then +4 because there's probably other areas in the home,
Other
like
sleeping
couches or
arrangements,
whatever.
yep. Okay.
So you can have 10 people under that scenario, but then you can also cap it at no more than 16. That was actually Benion's bill this past year.
The only problem with those kind of things too is enforcement, who's gonna go out and check it all the time, so it's
Yeah.
like, the only time you're gonna ever enforce that is if there's a big problem or an issue there. It just seems like a lot of cumbersome rules that you're never gonna really.
But then it just goes back to speed limit though, right? You're only gonna catch those ones that are super offenders, right? I mean, we have rules and laws that are ambiguous. I mean, they're pretty black and white, but the enforcement is not strict.
Yeah. And the courts, from what I've seen, they've said that if you have like 3-strike rule type thing, and so your owner that's doing the short-term rental is not controlling its people that it's renting to on a short-term rental basis. If they have 3 violations, then they get rid of their permit, and that's been upheld.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It is hard though. Code enforcement is always going to be hard, and that's any living situation. So if I just rent my house out and someone has, 5 families living there, as the owner, I might not even know that's going on, but who's the city gonna enforce it against? Is it gonna be the property owner or is it gonna be the people living there? And what if they're noisy, tenants? Not even looking at the short-term rental basis. That's hard. You definitely wanna cross-reference your business licensing section, so that way, you have some overlap between the two. And if you do have business licensing section, have a detailed application. You can require the permits on display of the property, evacuation plan, although, do you wanna treat short-term rentals like a hotel, which they kind of are? Or do you wanna treat them more like a long-term rental, which you'd never require evacuation plan for, someone that's staying there for more than 30 days? So I think there's a balance there. You could have a local contact, I've seen that upheld if the owner lives somewhat far away. So that way, if there is an issue, the city can call, or a neighbor can call this local contact and nip it in the bud. You definitely wanna have clear enforcement and penalties addressed, reasons for revocation, length of the license, and appeal language. Those on my side make it so much easier, so if court enforcement does have a good case, we have clear direction on how we tackle it. So, last question, what's your philosophy on government land use regulations? Should the government be able to tell you what you can do on your property? Or should the government be able to tell your neighbors what they can and can't do on the property? And then where do short-term rentals fall? So, no regulation, complete restriction. Typically, I think the answer's usually, it falls somewhere in the middle. And that's all I have.
Good job. Standing applause for Jared. Right now, we have no regulation.
We have no
No,
allowed.
we prohibit it.
We
Well,
prohibit them.
Prohibit it.
We prohibit them.
That's definitely a regulation.
We said we don't wanna deal with it.
But we're not enforcing, or we're attempting
Apparently we have
Some.
44 people who aren't,
compliant.
yeah.
And are we having a lot of complaints on those 44 people?
I get
Yes, and on those
It's the
44
same
specifically,
couple
most of them are
houses.
related to parking, right? The nuisance type issues that become noticeable to neighbors, that's generally how they come to us, is some sort of a nuisance issue that is readily identifiable by the surrounding neighborhood.
I mean,
Parking, noise, and trash, those are the problems usually that.
yeah, that would be obvious.
We had one in our
Nuisance to
neighborhood for a
crack
hot minute until we got on the homeowner.
And to the enforcement piece, it almost exclusively, we go to the property owner and not to the people who are staying there.
For sure.
Cause they don't know the ordinance, they just think it's a viable option.
Well, and the ignorance is not necessarily, a legal defense, but,
If
we
I
find
were
we get more
here,
traction out of
I wouldn't know.
the owner.
If I wanted to do it, I would just go to Airbnb and set it up.
Well,
I would have no idea.
I can tell you, I've Airbnb'd my house. I paid for my whole family vacation, somebody stayed there for 1 week. And I made several $1,000s. So it's like, no one knew, but none of you knew.
Well, now we know, so,
Now we know.
Cody,
What's the statute of limitations on that?
You gotta warn
This
me
was last
before you say
week.
stuff like that, so I can leave the room.
There's a
I know I
permit
passed
fee and some
statute of
taxes we need to
limitations.
collect.
But I also know that,
let's just say that was a hypothetical.
Hypothetically,
but I also know that there's, I think parking, I just want to be fully disclosed, it's like,
No, you
Right.
don't.
nobody complained about parking because all my people were off-street parking, right? Didn't get any complaints about noise because I didn't have any neighbors at the time. But I do now. So I just think that I think that it's overly restrictive when we say no one can do it. I think that if you put good parameters in place, I think that you probably get called about parking violations and noise violations and trash violations from.
that's what I was just gonna say,
From
it's not specific to short-term rentals,
Yeah.
those are problems that are pervasive throughout the city.
Yeah.
Every house that has a teenager. because they
So
have
I
five
mean,
cars.
that's the thing, I don't think it's just only because they're short-term rentals, right? But I think if you have good provisions around it, I don't believe it belongs in every place in the city. But I think that I do believe that, well, you just made a good example. Hey, my basement's empty, but I don't want people down there all the time, but hey, maybe maybe we're gone for the weekend, we can put them down, you know what I mean, it's things like that allows people to utilize their investment to make some additional money off of it. I just don't think I don't think that as a government we should restrict that.
I think we do need to have a discussion about it. Being the only one that was on the council at the time in 2017, I was fairly new at the time, and really what I remember of that conversation was pretty much what I said. We don't wanna deal with it. That.
Yeah, but we turned a blind eye rather than making an ordinance.
And believe it or not, 2017, we were a lot smaller city at the time. I believe it. Right?
Sure.
So I think we need to have a discussion. There's a lot of things. So to me, the first thing you have to ask is if it was your neighbor's house that was a permanent short-term rental, how would you like that? I'll give you a quick example.
There's one in your
We were
neighborhood.
in Austin for soccer this weekend. We rented a place. It was great. 16-year-old boys and 21 people in that house. Great party house, arcade room, billiards, whatever that rolling bowling thing is from. I mean, yeah, it had like everything, pool, hot tub. It was awesome. But those neighbors have to hate them. Like we were in a neighborhood. Right? I mean, and we were respectful. We had adults there and kept them quiet, and they had signs up, quiet after 10 p.m., whatever. But I mean, there was a line of 10 garbage cans on their side of the fence. And we were coming and going, and boys are loud. It's like, what do you want next door to you?
Yeah.
Like, what are the problems? To me, it's a question of what are the problems
But
that we
you know what?
foresee, and how. I'm not saying we don't want to do it. I think there's absolutely a place for it. It's just there are some issues that come up, and how do we do our best to mitigate
Yeah,
those?
I totally agree, but I've got neighbors who we just love, but they have a Halloween party and there's a ton of people that show up and there's cars all over the street and they're
Well, that's
in the
other thing I
backyard
was
being
thinking is
loud late at night and it's like,
I'd
it's
rather-
Halloween, it's okay,
I would
it
actually
happens,
have- I would actually rather have a short-term rental next to me than someone that rents it long-term to bad renters,
Yeah, no kidding, right?
right?
And they're bad homeowners.
Yeah.
I had some of those too, it's like, oh my gosh.
Not in Herriman
right?
though.
So there's
Right.
only so much we can do to mitigate problems, but I think that's our job is to talk through, all right, what are some reasonable steps to take?
Yeah, and I think it's funny, I didn't turn around when he asked how many people have stayed in them, but I think Michael was only in there. And so it seems funny to me that we would say every other community should have to have them, but Herriman doesn't have to deal with it. That doesn't seem right either, you know what I mean? It seems like we should
I
be able,
stayed in one this weekend, St.
Yeah.
George.
exactly.
My wife and kids wanted to come down at the last minute, and I'm like, we could stay in the hotel, but it's gonna be a ton of money for like half the price. We stayed in this great place over in the Desert Color thing with the lagoon and the pool, and I mean, it was
Those
awesome.
are great
I think
developments.
about it, yeah.
plans for
Short-term
that.
rentals aren't
Awesome.
allowed in Desert Color.
What's that? They are, but
They have a certain area.
there's certain area, you're right, and some of them are
I stayed in
the
this really cool
owner
house
occupant areas you
in
can't.
Herriman off of like 7300 West.
They have the Grinch cave too. You didn't show that one. That was pretty cool.
I just think I think it warrants discussion. I think
do
we
too.
should have a policy that would try and foresee some of the problems with it and then we move forward, and then if we have additional problems, we change up some policies.
It's very doable. We would just ask for some very clearly defined enforcement parameters that help us streamline
And
that
because of the
process.
huge numbers of people that listen to and watch our council meetings, we should see an uptick in like maybe 3 or 4 more rentals in the
Right,
city.
but the thing about it is we do have a trailhead coming to a place near you, right? And now we've had talks about hotels and things like that coming too, but in the meantime.
That'll draw more tourism and baseball and.
Right, but it also provides an opportunity for people who are coming in there to say, hey, that, just like you're saying, I can have my whole family stay here and we can have fun together and we can go do our competition and come back and spend some time together rather than everybody in a separate room at a hotel. And or leaving the community because there isn't enough
I'm sure the
hotels.
hotel that our team was supposed to stay at is grateful that we weren't there.
Should
Anyway,
we send this through planning commission? Is that where we start then?
Yeah. And I think as long as we're looking at some type of a ratio, I think that really addresses, a lot of the concerns I would have. And not that we would have an overwhelming number of short-term rentals, because again, we're not a destination
Yeah.
community.
But you think about
Yeah,
it,
so.
the continuity of a neighborhood, and I use the word integrity, I'm not talking about honesty, integrity, I'm talking structural integrity of a neighborhood and what it's supposed to be, single family residences sort of thing. If you have 50 homes in there and 10 of them are short-term rentals, that has an effect on the neighborhood feel, so.
And that's why Sandy did it the way they did it, is they didn't wanna burden one community, one subdivision over another subdivision, so they spread it out between the whole city.
And I think that's the smart.
That's the sort of thing that makes sense.
Okay.
You can also have a distance regulation, I've seen that also, where you can't have a short-term rental within 300 feet
First come,
of another
first
short-term
served.
rental.
Jared's house.
Yeah, Jared.
Good other places, just not next.
That's right.
Okay, well, good luck, Michael.
It'll be good, it'll be good.
Yeah, you might want to send some things around for the
Yeah.
council meeting,
Yeah.
that you get a bunch of
Yeah.
comments back.
Seriously?
When I did actually give this presentation to the planning commission,
Yeah.
although it was a little bit varied, but, it seemed like the planning commission were more or less, they were open to the idea of having short-term rentals as a permitted, limited but permitted use.
Yeah, again, I think the ratio really, I think addresses most concerns.
Motion to temporarily recess the city council meeting with the following members of staff: city manager, assistant city manager, city attorney, city recorder, finance director, assistant city attorney, community development director, planning director, and communications manager to convene in closed session in the Fort Herriman conference room for the purpose to discuss the character, professional competence, or physical or mental health of an individual pending or reasonable imminent litigation, and purchase, exchange, or lease of real property as provided by Utah Code annotated section 52-4-205.
Because the original language wasn't long enough.
Yeah, now I gotta start all over. I don't have a memory.
Second.
Second by Sherry, Jerry. Teddy,
Yes.
Sherry,
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes.
I vote yes.
It
Going
shouldn't
to
be
close.
too long.
Thank you,
Except for
everybody.
Todd.
They're always so full of good news.
He had 30
dying?
slides, so who knows?
We're glad
Whenever
you're
they,
there.
whenever they started saying it shouldn't take long,